Gator Bait by Paul Lonardo. Brad knew he had taken a wrong turn as soon as he started down the narrow dirt trail. The navigation system on his car had failed somewhere along Bayou Sale Road, while the signal on his phone had dropped an hour earlier. Now, he was relying entirely on his memory of a brief glimpse he got of the GPS map before he left his home in Mobile, Alabama. His brother-in-law, Charlie, was no help at all. He was sitting in the passenger seat, staring out of the side window with his mouth hinged open. Every 5 minutes he would either ask Brad how far away they were, or make such banal comments as, "It looks like we're getting close," and "We're so far off the grid we're going to need to leave a trail of breadcrumbs to find our way back." Brad wanted to tell him to keep his mouth closed and his eyes on the road in front of them so they didn't miss the turnoff. Yeah, but it was too late for that. Brad turned on the wipers to try to clear out the bugs that were baked onto the windshield, but all the washer fluid ended up doing was spreading the yellow-green goop across the glass like pate. With his visibility limited, he was forced to drive slower than he wanted. Now, traveling at the same speed as the insects, they swarmed all around the vehicle like they were in active pursuit. As he navigated his pickup around a sharp bend in the road, he had to avoid a faded sign that looked as if it had been hand-painted with black tar. It read, "Cajun Bill's Best Gator Swamp Tour in Louisiana." The post that the sign was attached was partially uprooted, and it was leaning over into the road at a 45-degree angle. "Is this it?" Charlie asked, his falsetto voice rising higher with his excitement. "Yep, this is it, all right," he said, answering his own question. "We're here. I can feel it." He lowered the passenger window to get a better look, and several species of butterflies, along with a huge dragonfly, entered the vehicle. "Hey!" Brad shouted as he swatted at chitinous wings fluttering like bits of colored paper around his head. "Close the window!" "Whoa!" Charlie exclaimed. Brad hit the brakes, thinking there might have been an animal in the road that his brother-in-law wanted him to avoid. "Would you look at that?" Charlie said. He opened the door and jumped out before the vehicle came to a complete stop. Brad cut the engine and got out of the air-conditioned truck to see what so fascinated his brother-in-law, and he was immediately introduced to the bayou's subtropical climate. He felt like a baked potato in a tinfoil suit. The heat of the day refused to relent even as twilight approached. The oppressive humidity caused him to gasp as if he was partially underwater, his lungs laboring to extract enough oxygen from the moist air. Charlie ran out so far ahead that Brad couldn't see where he had gone at first. He was about to call out his brother-in-law's name when he spotted Charlie standing about 50 yards away in a small clearing. His back was to Brad, and he was completely still. "Is there anything wrong, Charlie?" Brad asked, but he did not get any response from his brother-in-law. It wasn't until Brad reached Charlie that he saw the one-room shack among a stand of trees in the distance, the muddy waters of the endless bayou visible behind it. "This place is incredible, isn't it?" Charlie remarked with unrestrained enthusiasm, his eyes wide. "Ah, it's so beautiful. It's just the way I imagined it." Tucked in deep shadow beneath the branches of the thickly settled cypress and sprawling magnolia trees that were festooned with garlands of Spanish moss, the structure fit right in with the environment. Alligator skins and partial skeletons hung from the exterior walls, while the metal roof sagged precariously in the middle, orange-red rust drippings staining the ground around the dwelling like blood splatter. The solitary window was shuttered with an impenetrable layer of dirt and grime, a sightless cataract eye. Brad's heart clenched in his chest as he peered at the shack. Thanks to Charlie's reference to Hansel and Gretel with the trail of breadcrumbs comment, the simple construction brought to mind the fairy tale image of a gingerbread house in the middle of a primeval forest that was inhabited by a witch with cannibalistic inclinations. His first impulse was to tell his brother-in-law to get back into the air-conditioned truck so they could hightail it out of Louisiana, never to look back. Cajun Bill's isn't the name of the tour company I called, he said instead. Bayou Blue Swamp Excursions was the name, I believe. So what difference does it make? Charlie said. They got gator tours here. Best gator tour in the state, says so on the sign. That's exactly what we're looking for, ain't it? That's perfect. The magnificence of the bayou and all its untamed beauty was not lost on Brad, but he couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that they were being watched, and that something about this place wasn't right, despite his brother-in-law's proclamations otherwise. Majestic blue herons skimmed the surface of the slow-moving river and waded in the shallows for prey. Flocks of snow-white egrets raced through narrow tributaries. Groves of wild daisies filled the water from shore to shore. It truly was beautiful, but there were also implicit dangers in these backwaters, dark and terrible mysteries that are part of its nature. The swamps were infested with ticks, leeches, fire ants, and nutria, which were monstrous orange-toothed rats weighing more than 20 pounds and stretching 2 feet long, with scaly, sparsely haired tails that were 1.5 feet in length. Not to mention the various species of deadly spiders like the brown recluse and the black widow that reside in the bayou, along with 7 varieties of venomous snakes, including the Easter diamondback rattlesnake, a pit viper that can take down a human with this lethal venom. Yeah, no creature was safe there. Tarantula hawks were a type of large wasp indigenous to the bayou that prey on the large hairy arachnids. The sting of this insect paralyzes but does not kill its quarry, which it then drags into a brood nest as food. A single egg laid in the victim soon hatches to a larvae, which eats the still living host. Indeed, this was a vicious and hostile domain where life was expendable and survival depended on guile and instinct. And of course, there were alligators, rugged, frightful creatures that looked like they came from another world. Louisiana possessed one of the largest populations of gators on the planet, their watchful eyes poking out of the swamp water all around the bayou. Sometimes their presence could only be observed by the bubbles that came out of their eyes when air would escape their sinuses through their tear ducts. Exactly how this neglected old shack fit into the overall ecosystem of the Louisiana bayou, Brad did not want to find out. The only consolation he could see was that the rough-hewn dwelling appeared to be abandoned. The tire tracks from his truck were the only ones present in the moist brown soil, but the way the imprints disappeared around the corner and out of sight made it seem like they were all alone in the middle of the bayou, cut off from the rest of civilization. Brad's shoulders twitched involuntarily as he shuddered with the thought that they might not be able to find their way back to the main road, and the two of them would be lost here forever, a sweaty and dehydrated Hansel and Gretel. This place looks like it's been out of business for years, Brad told Charlie. I think we're out of luck. No sooner had he spoken these words when the sound of a creaking hinge and a door slamming shut drew their attention. Brad looked up and saw a shape exiting the cabin, a rotund man waddling out of the darkness toward them. The man was holding what appeared to be a whole chicken leg in his right hand, taking bites out of it as it continued forward at a sluggish pace. When he stepped out of the shadows, his features became visible. Brad did a double take. The man was a sight to behold. A mop of coarse white hair poked out from under the brim of a moth-eaten straw hat. His round face was sun-scorched and leathery. Small raised bumps were clustered on the tip and bridge of his bulbous nose as well as along the blades of his cheeks. He wore khaki coveralls caked with dry clay with no shirt underneath. The mud on his rubber galoshes was fresh, and he left wet prints in the crushed rock walkway behind him. A hatchet attached to a handmade leather holder dangled from his waist belt. Squinting into the setting sun, the man's eyes were narrow slits. In between bites, the man was humming a tune and reciting the words of some kind of folk song Brad was not familiar with. Down on the bayous of Louisiana, where the swamp moss grows on the back of your hand, Papa set out from our one-room shack, said he went fishing but he never came back. And Mama said, son, don't you ever go out to Arrow Swamp when the sun goes down. A creature down there called the Paralanguia, he's got your brother, now he's got your paw. As the man neared, Brad observed that what he was eating was not a drumstick. Brad couldn't tell what exactly it was, but it clearly was not cooked. The man's lips were red with fresh blood that dribbled down his chin. You must be Cajun Bill, Charlie asked. The man stopped in front of them. One and the same, he said with a thick drawl, spitting a mixture of saliva, blood, and bits of meat from the sides of his mouth as he spoke. Brad suddenly realized that the man was chomping on the half-eaten body of a large bullfrog. It must have been alive when he bit into it a moment earlier, because its tiny muscles were twitching involuntarily, as if in some futile last-ditch effort to escape. Cajun Bill paused and stuck the remains of the amphibian into his mouth, stripping the flesh and sinew off the skeleton. His cheeks bulged as he mashed the bullfrog to pulp with his teeth, the innards popping and the tiny bones crunching between his jaws. He was left holding a fragment of a leg bone with part of a ligament hanging off it. When he finished what he was chewing, he swallowed hard and casually discarded the remaining gristle, tossing it back over his shoulder. Yeah, what can I do for you fellas? Cajun Bill looked them both over. Y'all lost? He turned his head and cleared his throat, hawking a chunk of mashed frog guts along with some splintered bone fragments onto the ground between them. No, we ain't lost, Charlie said, with complete disregard for the display they had just witnessed. We came to see some swamp gators. Well, you comes to the right place. Cajun Bill cleared his throat, then stuffed a dirty index finger into his mouth and fished around for something that was stuck on his back teeth. When it was free, he sucked the morsel from his late afternoon snack off his finger, then belched obscenely. Yeah, I'll show you some gators you never gonna see nowheres else. I promise you all that. Hey, do you got any of them rare red gators in these parts? Charlie asked. I read somewhere on the internet about them red ones being the fiercest gators in existence. Supposedly, they have a taste for human blood, feeding on people who live and work in the bayou. But they especially like to devour tourists and hunters, outsiders who come to the swamp to pillage its resources. You spend too much time on the internet, Brad told his brother-in-law. There has never been a single confirmed sighting of a red alligator. They don't exist. Oh, they do exist, Charlie retorted. What about all the reports of shoes found floating in the bayou with the feet still in them, but never a leg or the rest of the body? Explain that, why don't you? And they say there's one gator that's bigger and meaner than all the rest combined, a cannibal that hunts, kills, and eats the red gators. That's why there's so few of them. This gator is supposed to be part human, a creature that can transform itself into the giant gator at will. They call him Gator Man. Oh, those are just stories that parents tell their children to discourage them from venturing out alone into the swamps at night, Brad said. It's a myth. That doesn't mean to call you no liar, mister, but it ain't no myth, Cajun Bill said, his eyes opening slightly and sparkling in the dim light. What this young fella says is true. Them red gators come straight from hell, they do. They skin is scorching hot, what makes them so ornery. And tasty, I might add. He smacked his lips. They practically cooking in their own skin. They the only gators I hunt. I got me a trick I use to lure 'em. Works every time. Gotta be live bait or they won't bite. I can take you up real close to one if you want. Charlie let out a soft, gleeful yelp. You can? He began bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet, the way he did when he was excited. Ooh, can you take us right now? I don't think that's such a good idea, Brad spoke up. It's getting kind of late, and we have a long drive back." "Yeah, best to wait a while until it's full dark," Cajun Bill said. "They only come up from the bottom of the bayou at night when it gets a little cooler." "Well, how much do you charge for a nighttime tour?" Charlie asked Cajun Bill. $20 each for the first hour," Cajun Bill said. $15 every hour after that." Charlie turned to Brad with a look of exuberant expectation on his face, like a child on Christmas morning. Brad exhaled sharply and hesitated as he considered the arrangement. But the truth was he had no choice. They'd gotten a late start, leaving Mobile at noon, which was his fault. He had slept in, looking forward to watching the entire Sunday, having forgotten all about the plans he made with his brother-in-law to drive to Louisiana to go on a tour of the bayou. It was approaching dusk now, and it wouldn't be practical to go anywhere else. Besides, he couldn't disappoint Charlie, who had his heart set on this trip for months. Reaching into his back pocket, Brad pulled two 20s out of his wallet. At least this tour was a bargain, he thought, as he handed the cash to Cajun Bill. It was a lot cheaper than any of the other swamp tours he had priced, including the one he booked with Bayou Blue Swamping Excursions. Fortunately, he hadn't paid them in advance, so he was saving a few bucks. As he stuffed the bills into the center pocket of his coveralls, Cajun Bill smiled, revealing tiny bits of frog flesh snagged between his red-stained teeth. Then he announced that he was going back inside the shack to get a couple waterproof rain suits for them to wear. As he waddled away, he sang another verse from the folk song. "I told my mama gotta make things right, going hunting down in Arrow Swamp tonight. The stories that the old man told to me, you gotta stick it with a stick from a sweet gum tree. A whippoorwill cried and I prayed to God, and I headed for the swamp in a cold gray fog. Hours passed, it was drizzling rain when I realized that I lost my way." Brad saw Cajun Bill's momentary departure as their opportunity to leave and make it out of the bayou while it was still light. They could always come back for a swamp tour some other time, and he would be sure to plan it better. Following this plan, all he stood to lose was $40, but it would be worth every cent for the peace of mind alone. "Come on, Charlie, let's go," Brad said, grabbing hold of his brother-in-law's shirt sleeve and tugging gently to get him to move. Charlie resisted and then pulled free from Brad's grasp. "Why would we go?" "I told you, this is not the right place." "I don't know what your problem is, Brad," Charlie began. "You said you'd take me. We've been driving all afternoon. We're here now. And you paid him already." He paused, a smile turning up the corners of his mouth as he looked at Brad. "This is going to be great. Come on, you'll see." Brad wanted to believe Charlie, but he was feeling more than just a little uneasy in Cajun Bill's presence. He was genuinely scared. He didn't know if Cajun Bill was a representative of the entirety of the people in this part of Louisiana, and maybe everyone spoke that way and devoured live frogs the way others would bite into an apple. But Brad didn't want to stick around to find out. He had seen enough. To get Charlie to go along with him, he knew he had to be more forceful and insist they leave at once. Before he had a chance to say anything to his brother-in-law, however, Cajun Bill emerged from the shack with two rain suits in hand. Brad felt trapped, and his disquiet intensified as he went along with Charlie's obsessive desire to see those reptilian throwbacks from some bygone era lurking about in their festering environment in the deep south. Brad's wetsuit fit him perfectly, but Charlie's was much too small. The proprietor invited Charlie inside to try on some others that might fit him better, and off the two of them went. Left alone, Brad took the time to wander closer to the swamp, stopping on the edge of the shore where a small airboat was moored to a dilapidated dock. The flat-bottomed watercraft sat atop a brackish, watery world that supported a diverse ecosystem. The extent of the wildlife habitat that the bayou sustained was staggering. and the sounds it produced were at once beautiful and unearthly, an incessant chorus of birds, frogs, crickets, and a myriad other insects. With the sun dipping behind the treetops to the west, the repetitive cries of the whippoorwill had begun, while nearby a pair of raccoons rolled and splashed around in the mud. Brad never felt more out of his element than he did at that moment. The lack of control made him want to blame someone for putting him in this predicament. This little excursion was not his idea, and he wanted to kick himself for getting talked into it. His wife Donna had asked him if he would take her brother on a Louisiana Gator tour for his birthday. Although Charlie had just turned 30, he had the intellectual capacity of a teenager. Since last April, when Charlie's parents were killed in a car wreck after getting caught in a severe thunderstorm that had produced numerous tornadoes near their home in Alabama, Charlie had been in a bad way, to put it mildly. To be more accurate, Charlie was depressed and practically suicidal. He had been wholly dependent upon his parents financially, emotionally, and every other way, and now the responsibility of looking out for him had fallen entirely upon Donna. It was a burden she was managing rather well, though it was beginning to take its toll on her physical and mental health. Worrying about her brother had affected her sleep and left her exhausted all the time. Brad had consented to take his brother-in-law on a swamp tour because he wanted to do something nice for Donna as much as Charlie. Their marriage had taken several big hits recently, beginning with their daughter going off to college on the East Coast. Bella had been their whole world, and 18 years of parenting had supplemented much of their individual lives as well as their relationship as a couple. Instead of getting to know each other all over again, Brad had reconnected with his old girlfriend Deborah Martin from college. Deb had reached out to him after she relocated to Spanish Fork for work. And they began an affair that lasted several months before Brad broke it off, feeling crushing guilt the entire time. His anxiety gave him such an upset stomach that he couldn't eat. He had lost so much weight that Donna wanted him to see a doctor, fearing some dreadful health ailment. When Donna's parents were killed, this gave him the incentive he needed to end the affair. And as a way to try to make up for his infidelity, he agreed to take Charlie on a tour of a genuine alligator-filled swamp in the Louisiana bayou, something his brother-in-law wanted to do his whole life. Charlie had been looking forward to this adventure ever since. Brad didn't want to disappoint Charlie, but now he wished he hadn't made any such promise. The bayou was heavy in Brad's nostrils. He had been around wetlands before, mostly along the Mississippi Delta, but the tang of the bayou was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The air had an incongruous fragrance, a rich, organic smell combined with something completely unnatural like wet leaves and burning rubber. Everything existed there at once. Brad could taste the acidic residue of fear in his mouth. He was prepared to jump into his F-150 and leave Cajun Bill to his raw frog diet as soon as Charlie returned. Then he heard a sound he never expected. Agonized screams following the reconnaissance of violent impacts, like a dull axe penetrating the bark of soft wood. It was hard to be sure, but Brad thought it was Charlie screaming, and it seemed to be coming from the shack. Brad looked up, an artery in his neck pulsating as his heart rate shot up at once. He tried to dispel the image of Cajun Bill's hatchet from his mind as he made his way to the structure as quickly as his jelly legs would allow. As he got closer, the screaming intensified. He looked around for a weapon of some kind, a rake, a shovel, a sturdy branch, but there was nothing in plain sight. His vision started to blur and he felt a little queasy as he reached the door. The rusted hinges resisted, and he had to push as hard as he could to gain entry. "Charlie?" he called out as he burst inside. "Charlie, are you okay?" It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the darkness, and when they did, he immediately saw his brother-in-law sitting up on the floor, his back against the far wall. One of his wrists was shackled to a steel loop cemented into the ground, and he was bleeding from a gash on his forehead. "Help me," Charlie pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes fluttered in their sockets. He was on the verge of unconsciousness. Just then, Brad noticed that his brother-in-law's left leg had been hacked off at mid-thigh. The nub of his exposed femur was smashed and splintered. There was so much blood pooled around him that Brad thought there had to be other victims being held captive and tortured in the shack. Oh my God. Brad felt his gorge rise and he staggered back gagging, vomit spilling from the sides of his mouth. Something came out of the darkness behind him just as he stumbled over Charlie's amputated limb, and as a result, the blunt end of the hatchet, intended for the back of Brad's head, only grazed his temple. He went down hard, yowled in pain as his tailbone struck the blood-soaked floor with a numbing crunch that electrified the nerves running down his legs. He maintained consciousness, and he was able to scramble to his feet and out the door. "Yeah, gotta be live bait," Cajun Bill said, giving chase, "or they won't bite." Brad thought he could still outrun the old-timer and get to his truck safely, even with the blow to his head and his legs wobbly, but then he heard an unusual hissing sound and made the mistake of turning around to see what it was. Astounded by the sight, he was unable to look away. He paused momentarily, and that was all it took to seal his fate. He wondered if the knock to his skull was more serious than he thought, making him see something that wasn't real. He could only watch in wide-eyed terror as Cajun Bill began to shapeshift before his very eyes. The man's face distorted and elongated, his eyes rolling up in the top of his head as a scaly snout pushed outward, blunt teeth lining the top and bottom of its jaws. His arms shrank back, as did his legs, and a thick muscular tail formed behind him. Just like that, the man had completely transformed into an absurdly large alligator with skin the color of blood. Its ancient lizard eyes locked on Brad, and the beast hissed again. As the colossal reptile lurched forward, Brad made a feeble effort to run, but only managed a couple of steps before his feet got tangled in some Spanish moss vines and he tumbled to the ground. When he looked back, the sprawling gator raised its legs and belly off the ground and transitioned to a high walk, slithering toward him at a surprising rate of speed. Brad made a futile attempt to get up, but it was too late. The 25-foot monster growled a deep rumbling vocalization. The next thing Brad knew, the creature was positioned over him, and he realized there was no escape. The reptile's sinister grin was the last thing he saw before the spoon-shaped jaw with nearly 100 blunt teeth closed like a vice on his left shoulder. Brad's cries were drowned out by the crunching of bone. The intense agony was thankfully short-lived as he quickly lost consciousness. When he came to a short time later, he was sitting on the deck of an airboat that was swaying gently on the water. He was propped upright, his back against the cage of the propeller, which was idle. His shoulder was throbbing and his legs tingled, but he couldn't move. It was full dark, but a magnificent hunter's moon blanketed the bayou in spectral silver light, Spanish moss shivering in the trees like ghostly veils. Standing directly in front of him at the bow of the boat was the corpulent and naked frame of Cajun Bill, who was baiting a hook. The line he was holding was one of many that were hanging from trees along the starboard side of the boat and suspended a couple feet above the waterline to attract gators. Brad couldn't tell what was being used for bait, but it was some kind of meat. And Brad suddenly remembered Charlie, and horror instantly paralyzed his brain. He didn't want to consider what Cajun Bill had planned for him as he deliberately kept his gaze outside the boat. He resisted the urge to look down at his body, but he found it impossible, and he finally gritted his teeth and lowered his eyes. What he saw was worse than anything he could have imagined. His left leg was skeletal, completely denuded of flesh and muscle, picked clean off the bone. Only his foot remained below the ankle. It didn't look real, and he felt nothing. It was like he was looking at the horrific results of a post-mortem tissue donation surgery that had been performed on someone else. On the right side of his lower body, half of the thigh was missing, neat wedges of flesh carved out and removed, like slices from a birthday cake that had been parceled out to party guests. He opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Standing over him was Cajun Bill, who began to sing a song that had now become familiar to Brad. Down on the bayou of Louisiana, where the swamp moss grows on the back of your hand, my mama lives alone in a one-room shed. Her boy went hunting, but he never came back. And the Paralangua's a swamp booger man. He's half alligator and the other half man. Son, don't go when you hear the call of the swamp water booger, the Paralanguia. Holding an oversized treble hook in one hand and the hatchet in the other, Cajun Bill brought the weapon down with sudden swift ferocity, cleaving through the upper thigh of his captor's right leg, notching out another chunk of meat. The blade got caught in the femur beneath, and Cajun Bill had to step on Brad's right foot to yank it free. Then he grabbed the slab of thigh meat and threaded it onto the point of the bait hook. I gotta be live bait or they won't bite, Cajun Bill repeated over and laughed as he set another trap and waited for one of the flesh-eating red gators to come along and take the live bait. And the Paralangua's a swamp booger man. He's half alligator and the other half man. Son, don't go when you hear the call of a swamp water booger, the Paralanguia.